You and I are living in a time that Kafka had already lived through, where disaster could come at any moment, a heavy gavel hanging over our heads, ready to drop. This is something Kafka portrayed beautifully in his incomplete novel, The Trial. In it, the protagonist summed up his entire absurd life in 3 words at the moment of his death: like a dog. Whenever the concept of absurdism comes up, my mind immediately goes to Albert Camus, who offered a way to live a happy life in the face of absurdity. But today, I'll focus on The Trial, a novel by Franz Kafka, the writer of despair and sadness. While it teaches us that life is absurd, it also makes us question what creates that absurdity, what led the protagonist to those final haunting words, like a dog, at the time of his death. All of this will be explained in this video. Let's begin with a summary of The Trial, so you can understand the beauty of the later discussion. Franz Kafka began writing The Trial in 1914 to 1915, but it wasn't published until after his death in 1925. The original manuscript is preserved in the Museum of Modern Literature in Germany, and its first English translation was completed in 1937 by Willer and Edwin Muir. After Kafka died, his friend Max Brod arranged the manuscripts into the form we know today, despite Kafka's wish to have them destroyed. The story begins on Joseph K's 30th birthday. He's a bank cashier living a relatively ordinary life until one morning when he's suddenly arrested. The strange thing is, he's told he's under arrest for a crime, but no one explains what the crime is or who's behind the arrest. Despite being arrested, he's told to go on with his life as usual, even going to work as if nothing is wrong. Joseph K. lives in a boarding house run by Frau Grubach, who still seems to think highly of him even though he's under arrest. The house is also home to 2 women, Fräulein Berner and Fräulein Montag. Joseph K. tries to get closer to Fräulein Berner, though he finds Fräulein Montag intimidating. Soon enough, Joseph receives an order to appear in court on Sunday, but the time and place aren't specified. After wandering around, he finally finds the court, which is located in an attic of a building where poor people live. Instead of meeting with officials, he finds an attendant's wife who's washing clothes. She points him to a room where the court officials are. They're angry with him for being late and insist that he take the trial seriously. Joseph, knowing he's done nothing wrong, argues with them, pointing out how corrupt the system is and how unethical the officers were when they first arrested him. The court session ends and Joseph leaves, but the next Sunday he returns to the building. The same woman, the usher's wife, is there again. She seduces him and tells him she can help with his case because she knows the magistrate. Just then, a law student walks in, claiming the woman as his mistress, which surprises Joseph. Back at his office one day, he hears the sound of someone being beaten. Following the noise, he discovers Fren and Wilhelm, the 2 warders who arrested him, being flogged in a storage room. They are being punished for accepting bribes during Joseph K's arrest. The sight horrifies Joseph, and he tries to intervene, but the flogger ignores him and continues. This continues the next day as well. Later, Joseph's uncle visits him and introduces him to Harold, a pompous lawyer. Both of them seem to know about his case, even though Joseph doesn't understand why. Harold's nurse, Lenny, becomes infatuated with Joseph and eventually becomes his lover. While working with Harold, Joseph meets Rudy Block, another one of the lawyer's clients, who's been in his trial for 5 years. Block explains how the trial has worn him down emotionally and financially, turning him from a once wealthy grain dealer into a submissive shell of a man. At one point, overwhelmed by the chaos of it all, Joseph K. decides to fire his lawyer, not knowing what the case is about or when it might end. Harold uses Block as an example of the hopelessness of the system, pointing out that Block hasn't even attended his first court appearance after 5 years. In another strange encounter, Joseph K. is asked to show an Italian client around a cathedral, but when the client doesn't show, he meets a priest instead. The priest tells him a parable called Before the Law. In the story, a man wants to enter a door guarded by a doorman. The doorman refuses, saying it's not the right time. The man tries everything, bribery, persuasion, but the doorman still denies him entry, claiming the man hasn't tried enough. As the man dies, the doorman reveals that the door was meant only for him and is now closed forever. Joseph K. asks the priest who's at fault, and the priest explains that the man is to blame for not understanding that the doorman's life was a prison waiting for someone who could never enter. The novel ends with Joseph K.'s execution on the eve of his 31st birthday, 1 year after the trial began. 2 men come to carry out the execution. They take him to a quarry outside the city and stab him with a knife. Now this is what is called Kafkaesque, a term that was eventually added to the dictionary. It means many things, but today I'll focus on one of the 2 major themes I found most interesting in this novel. Joseph K. suffers more in his life than at the time of his death. Why? Because of how bizarre his life had turned. He doesn't know when the court will call him or when he'll receive his punishment or freedom. At first, he didn't take it seriously, one reason being that he thought his office workers were pranking him on his 30th birthday, and another because he didn't believe it was true or that he had done anything wrong. But soon, he became obsessed. He couldn't stop overthinking, wondering when his life would collapse or when he might be set free. Many readers criticize the protagonist for this obsession, believing Joseph K. shouldn't have taken it seriously at all. He should have just accepted the absurdity of the situation and followed Camus' advice, why bother, or simply, whatever. This, they argue, would be the only way for him to live a happy life. I'd like to add a bit about Camus' philosophy, which, in my view, could have been an answer for Joseph K., and honestly for all of us too, at some point in our lives. According to Camus, keeping a few simple words in mind can make life a lot less tense. Who cares? Doesn't matter. Why worry about it? Why not? So what? Absurdism acknowledges that our lives, with their repetitive routines and endless cycle, are like the story of Sisyphus, an existence that may seem monotonous or even depressing. Just like Joseph K., it's a scenario that mirrors our own lives. Think about the daily 9-to-5 grind, where each day bleeds into the next. Camus viewed Sisyphus's endless task as a reflection of how we live, but instead of despairing, he encouraged us to keep pushing. Joseph K. should have thought the same. Who cares if he loses a few pounds as punishment? He should have taken life easy in the dilemma. He should have embraced the thought, what's the worst that could happen? Even if failure was inevitable, he should have kept going, embracing life's absurdity and recognizing that in the end we're all meant to stumble and start over by simply saying, so what? By embracing a so what attitude, the fear of failure starts to lose its grip, freeing us to take risks and pursue goals that once felt intimidating. This mindset of not being held back by outcomes, but focusing on the act of doing, unlocks courage, resilience, and a life led by personal ambition rather than the pressure of external validation. After all, even Sisyphus, with his endless task, found happiness in the journey. We're luckier still because we have the choice to do different things, to explore, and to make changes along the way. Instead of settling for nihilism, absurdism offers us something more. As Camus put it, you will never be happy if you continue to search for what happiness consists of. You will never live if you are looking for the meaning of life. Anyway, absurdism isn't a complete answer to all of Joseph K.'s questions. His absurd state stemmed from one main reason: the authority and how they controlled him whenever they wanted. This is the psychology of power and evil that suppresses ordinary people like Joseph, and by extension, all of us. I'll discuss this further in the next chapter. I discussed the psychology of evil in detail in my previous video on why good men become monsters. I'll add the link in the description so you can learn more about it. For now, let me touch on some key points and explain how they relate to Joseph K's situation in the trial. Joseph K was trapped in a dilemma for almost a year, between his 30th and 31st birthdays, which felt like a century due to the authorities' grip on him. The authority of the bureaucratic system justified its actions through its sheer opacity and invincibility, creating an environment where morality is irrelevant and compliance becomes inevitable. Much like today, the system doesn't rely on overt coercion, but on embedding individuals within a vast, dehumanizing structure where resistance feels futile. The trial of Joseph K is not about guilt or innocence, but about submission to a process designed to strip away individuality and autonomy. The system never provides clear reasons for K's arrest or trial, maintaining a psychological state of confusion and helplessness. This ambiguity serves to justify the system's authority by withholding explanations. The system implies that its power is self-evident and unquestionable. As K becomes more entangled in the absurd bureaucracy, he ends up participating in his own subjugation, reflecting how authority convinces individuals to accept its actions as inevitable or even necessary. The psychology behind this authority-driven evil lies in its ability to dehumanize. In Kafka's world, individuals are not seen as people, but as cogs in a huge machine. This dehumanization allows the bureaucratic apparatus to operate without moral restraint. Joseph K, despite being a high-ranking professional, is treated as an insignificant entity whose rights and dignity are secondary to the system's needs. The court officials, who themselves are victims of the hierarchy, perpetuate its oppressive practices because their roles demand their actions. However unjust or cruel, they rationalize them as part of their duties within the system. In the trial, power is diffuse and its sources are hidden. The judges, inspectors, and warders are faceless representatives of an overarching authority. This lack of accountability diminishes any personal responsibility for their actions. The inspectors' refusal to explain the charges against K and their mechanical adherence to procedure demonstrate how individuals within a hierarchy detach themselves from the consequences of their actions. The participants in the system, from court officials to minor clerks, rationalize their behavior by framing it as a necessity dictated by the system. This becomes clear when K interacts with officials who admit their own lack of authority but still enforce the system's will. Their compliance shows how individuals suppress moral instincts when they see themselves as mere instruments rather than autonomous moral agents. The trial seems to critique how power justifies its actions by normalizing harm. In the bureaucratic world of the trial, cruelty is not enacted for personal gain, but as a natural outcome of systemic processes. The court's labyrinthine structure, its oppressive spaces filled with suffocating air and endless documents, is a physical manifestation of how authority enforces its will through psychological domination rather than explicit violence. Ultimately, the trial is not just about the struggle of one man. It highlights the absurdity of life under authority and the mechanics of how power works. In Joseph K.'s final words, we see how futile his existence had become within the bureaucracy, a soul crushed under the weight of an indifferent system. The bureaucratic machinery that perpetuates the system does not care about right or wrong. It does not care whether Joseph K. lives or dies. All that matters is that the machine continues to function, and Joseph K. was but one piece that was ultimately discarded. His fate is a tragic reminder that systems of power do not operate on justice, but on control and submission. We are left to wonder whether Joseph K.'s suffering was inevitable or whether it could have been prevented. Could his absurdist mindset have helped him navigate this system more effectively? We'll explore these questions in the next part.